Nothing does numbers more than someone hating you. And so it would be disingenuous for me to say, we reached 3 million people last week when 2.8 of those million people were there like yelling at us, being like, you're the worst people in the entire world.
Welcome to the GovComms podcast, bringing you the latest insights and innovations from experts and thought leaders around the globe in government communication. Now, here is your host, David Pembroke.
Hello everyone, and welcome once again to GovComms, a podcast about the practice and function of communication in government and the public sector. My name is David Pembroke. Thanks for joining me. As we begin, may I first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where we are broadcasting from today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the ongoing contribution they make to the life of our city and this region. Indeed, I'd like to pay my respects to all First Nations people of the lands from where anyone listening to this podcast today is joining us from. Well, people, how are you going with your content? Are you keeping up? Here at Content Group, we released a new podcast a few weeks ago. Now, nothing to do with GovComms, it's about rugby union, but what struck me is just how much work there is to do in getting a new tactic up and running. The thinking, the planning, the workflows, the production, the editing, the distribution, the evaluation, it goes on, and it's exhausting. And given there are so many people, so many organisations, so many government departments, so many brands, so many not-for-profits who are all competing for a share of people's most valuable asset, their time and their attention, the competition is only going to get hotter. So how do we, as government communicators, think about our place, think about our stories, our impact? How do we get noticed? And how do we keep up with the pace and demands of being successful on the digital platforms? In a world where a single TikTok can reach millions and misinformation moves faster than fact, the pressure on public sector communicators to get useful, relevant and verified information in front of people fast has never been greater. Social media is no longer just about convenient and cheap reach and one-way messaging. It's about trust, tone and timing. It's where millions of people turn during crises and where reputations can be built or broken overnight. Today, we're diving into the challenges and opportunities facing government comms teams, from emergency communication and creative constraints to launching bold new ideas inside bureaucracies. And I can't think of a better person to talk to us about that in Kendall Masters. Kendall is currently the Director of Channels and Content at the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, where she leads digital communication strategy. Prior to that role, she headed social media at Victoria Police, where in one of her final acts, she championed and succeeded in introducing TikTok as a channel to engage younger audiences and to modernise community outreach. Throughout her distinguished career, Kendall has held roles at the South Australian Health Department, the Department of Education in South Australia, and also with the Victorian Ombudsman and the Department of Health in Victoria. In those roles, she's not only had to manage business as usual communication, but also the high tempo, high stress, high stakes, high impact communications required to communicate with communities during floods, fires and health emergency. She joins me in the studio. Kendall, welcome to GovComms.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I like to start at the beginning with people to get to know them. So what is the Kendall Masters story?
Okay, interesting one. Where should I start? I'll probably stick to my professional background, since that's what we're here to talk about. I originally started studying law and journalism for no other reason. I think it's very common for people who are strong writers or have an interest in writing or reading to all the way through school kind of work under this assumption, or at least it was when I was at school, that you're going to come out the other end as a journalist. And I feel like it's really sad that some more of the opportunities within comms, which in lots of ways can be a lot more creative, a lot more diverse, aren't really broadcast to kids. So I would say I got part of the way through my journalism degree and started to realise that if I truly wanted to be a journalist, you can become a journalist and get work in the media without a degree. And I had that ability to seek those roles out in the meantime, and I wasn't doing it. So maybe that's not where my passion was lying. Ended up transferring into a management advertising kind of like marketing hybrid degree.
Did you stick with the law as well?
No, the law, if we're honest, I got quite good marks in year 12, which I just didn't want to say. That sounds so bad. I got good marks at school. So I think I got more than what I needed to go into journalism, and it just felt like the degree that everyone did if they weren't quite sure what they wanted to do. And it was fun. I found it really interesting, but I also didn't envision myself working in law at all at that stage. I mean, I think interestingly, if you contextualise me ending up at Victoria Police and even Victoria Ombudsman, in lots of ways I ended up in a place that was kind of between marketing, journalism and law in a couple of the areas I've worked in.
Did you get any way through the degree? Through the law degree?
So the way it worked at that stage was you do a year of law, a year of journalism. I got to the end of my year of journalism having done the year of law, year of journalism, and I was like, I think I want to do marketing. Right.
Okay. So you left it there.
Yeah, left it there.
Okay.
I mean, it was very helpful though, because I was able to use it for all of the legal subjects that I had in like my following degree.
Okay. Yeah.
And ended up in marketing, which was much more like a business focused degree. At the time I was like, I am never going to use any of this. And I was so wrong about that. There was so many aspects of what I did at uni, and the ones that I did not think were going to be helpful, that have been so helpful to my background in particularly in social media. Because
what subjects?
We did so much study around analytics and actually processing information and making sense of which parts mattered.
Yep.
That at the time I really actively despised, but they have made my ability to process the like wealth of information you can get from all of these platforms and like kind of cut out the stuff that's like relatively meaningless and translate it into something that's meaningful to other people. So that was actually something that was incredibly useful.
Yeah,
the other thing is, and you get told this all the way through school, it's really important that you're able to present. And I was always like, I don't see myself if I'm not going into journalism, I don't see a scenario where I'm going to need to present on a regular basis. And I was so wrong about that, because I think one of my biggest strengths has been my ability to process this information into something that was meaningful to other people and then also present it to them.
Yeah. And to be able to influence different audiences as you go, to bring them along on the journey that you want to take them on.
So I would say I spent the first couple of years of my career thinking, oh my God, I did not need a degree for any part of this job. But retrospectively, there are elements of it that have certainly come in handy. That said, I've had conversations with like people I've managed who didn't have a degree background, and I don't feel like it was an impediment to them to not have that. And they asked me whether it was worthwhile, I thought, going and getting a like more generalist degree.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to generalist degrees, maybe not as much, but if you've got like a very specific area that you maybe don't already work in and you're interested in moving into that area, then I think there's probably some real merit to it there. But yeah, that's kind of my philosophy on those things.
So you did a marketing sort of business degree. Were you ever tempted to sort of head into the private sector? Because you've obviously focused pretty heavily throughout your career in the public sector.
Yeah, so I guess I almost landed there a little bit by accident. I was working at a hospital the whole way through uni to pay rent. And I remember feeling like a bit frustrated as I got towards the end of uni, because it definitely felt like your best path into a job that you really cared about was to already have like an in or be working for free in that area in some way. And that wasn't an option available to me at the time, because I was living out of home. I did have to actually work more or less full time for the last couple of years of my degree. And yeah, it didn't feel like something I was able to do.
What sort of job were you doing in the hospital? Was it anything related to comms?
General admin stuff.
Okay.
And I remember specifically getting an email one day, and it was like some sort of like marketing email that would have gone to the whole department, and the sort of stuff that like when you work an admin job in that sort of area, like, and I will say one of the hardest jobs I've ever done, one of the most stressful jobs I've ever done. And, you know, you do have people coming at you from all sides and a lot of like different priorities, and you don't do things like read your emails, to be honest. Like, I think lots of people who work in somewhat frontline jobs will say that they don't read their emails.
Yeah.
And I remember receiving an email and being like, oh, I wonder if like someone with like a marketing background has actually written this, or like comms. And then looking into kind of like the intranet and discovering that there was like a whole like marketing and comms unit that existed within the hospital. And I thought that's like a really interesting kind of like area that I hadn't maybe considered even existed before. And I actually really did like a lot about working kind of in the hospital in health. And I do remember.
So did you wander down the corridor and go and make yourself known?
I emailed them and asking if they ever took on work experience students or anything like that, told them where I worked. At that time they couldn't, but it did kind of make me realise that there were jobs within government that were kind of suited to my skill set, and I had good background to bring to them through the work I had been doing on a paid basis. And I think at that stage I must have signed up to the state government kind of Jobs Gazette. And as things, I don't 100% know how it works in APS, to be completely honest, but in state government, there's normally jobs that are available, short-term jobs that are only available to people who are already in the system, and I was technically already in the system. And there was a 5-month job that came up working in the comms and marketing division of SA Health. Yep. And 5-month jobs are not that appealing to most people, and it was what is considered a relatively entry-level job. And it was the best thing I could have done for my career, because not only was that team just incredible, I think having worked a lot of other places now, I can look back and be there are so many things they did that were indisputably best practice, highly strategic, quite a kind of small operation, really valued everyone taking on bits of everything. So in that very first job, I got exposure to paid advertising, to social media, which I found immediately very interesting. I got to do things like making posters, making pull-up banners, all of those sorts of things. And actually it's really fun at the start of your career to make those really tactile things, because you're I can see that piece of work I've done. Yeah. And also in all of that, they had such a strategic approach to everything. And again, something that at the start I didn't necessarily value, this approach where you are writing a comms plan for what is relatively manageable things. I think at the time I was this seems like a lot of admin for something that's kind of formulaic, we do the same kind of, have the same comms toolkit most of the time. But the further I've come through my career, the more helpful I find it to get people to actually follow that kind of structure, to distill their thoughts into something that exists and also exists when someone says, what are you guys doing for this? You're not just giving some vague answers. You're saying, here's our plan. Yeah. So
something that's connected to objectives, business objectives.
More than anything, it is the connection to business objectives. And that's something in social media you're often finding a bit of a battle on, because it can be easy for people from the outside to look in and be well, you're just posting pictures of dogs. And where in actual fact, if you've gone to the trouble of articulating how the pictures of dogs link to your own business objectives, that's watertight. And that's what I really encourage people to do, spend that time doing that.
Yeah. So from that entry-level position, and as you say, you're having those experiences, whether it's paid advertising, creative campaigns, graphic design. Where and when did you, and I'm sure you did some media relations in there as well, when and where and which of your jobs did you decide, hey, this social media thing, this might be for me? Where and when and how did you make that decision?
So I've been back and forth on this decision, and actually someone this week said to me something that made me realise some of my psyche around it as well. I definitely think I've got a bit of a creative lean, so social media immediately was something that I was oh, that is something I'm really interested in. And I was so interested in it at health initially, and it wasn't somewhere where they had a role where I was able to do it exclusively. Yeah. I didn't necessarily want to do it exclusively, but I did want it to be a fairly well-defined part of my job. Yeah.
And can I ask what year that was? How many years ago are we going back now?
16, 17.
Okay, all right. Pretty early days.
Yeah. I mean, the glory days of organic reach on social media, though, if we're being completely honest, it's been a bit more of an uphill battle ever since then. And then I was also ready to do something that gave me a little bit more responsibility. A role came up as a marketing advisor at the Department for Health Department for Education in Adelaide, with a sole focus on social media, specifically also on video content, which I took on. I think I did that for about a year, and then felt a little bit concerned that by concentrating too specifically on social media, that was going to be career limiting, and it's true to maybe a slightly lesser extent now, but most people in senior leadership positions in government agencies have like a very like old school media background. Most like senior managers have some sort of like strike comms background, etc. And so I felt like by kind of like leaving strike comms behind completely and focusing just on social media, I was kind of putting myself in a difficult spot for my next role.
Yeah. And sorry to interrupt you, but you said a video focus. So what were you shooting?
Yeah,
shooting
and editing a lot of videos.
A lot of videos.
Which at the time, like I didn't have that. I like learned a lot of that on the job, and it was like before we had CapCut and all of these tools that make it really easy. I will say I came away from that job at the end being like, there's got to be apps that are going to make this really easy for us eventually.
Yeah.
And that has absolutely happened.
Yeah.
But we were using Premiere Pro, doing everything the hard way. But it was really useful for me to have those skills.
Great skill.
And more than anything, even if I've only edited a handful of videos on Premiere Pro since I left that job, I still like remember bits. I still know things about editing, like fixes because I always tell people I'm actually terrible at taking photos and I'm terrible at filming. I make up for it in the edit phase. Like that's where I do my best work.
Okay.
The creative approaches to fixing the problems that I have created. It's not like I've had phases where I've been like a little bit passionate about making video content again. I have.
What about
mixed,
now when it's all the rage?
So I have difficulty distilling my thoughts on this one because I think, and not to preempt any of the conversations we have like moving forward, but the government's understanding of what is good video is, I think, a little bit flawed. And I so often see government agencies, particularly on social media, implementing video for video's sake instead of because the messaging lends itself to video.
Yeah.
And I think maybe in that phase we were all in on video because, and I did think this at the time, the stats were artificially inflating video. People weren't necessarily watching enough of it to take on a message, and I mean, Facebook literally did get in trouble for artificially inflating the statistics on their videos. Yes. And there was a lot of agencies that pivoted to this kind of like video all the time thing. And it's not necessarily the most efficient way of getting, it's rarely the most efficient way of getting a message across. It can be done really well, especially for engagement. But when it comes to getting a message across, it's sometimes like very inefficient. And to this day, I see government comms that are animated for animation's sake, not because it's actually useful. So if your text is like floating onto the screen and people are having to wait 10 seconds to see the message when they're likely just scrolling past, that's not a good use of video content. But we got to do lots of like really sweet, nice stories with kids that were engagement pieces at education. So it did kind of suit what we were trying to do at that time. But my thoughts on video is always that it makes sense in a mix of other things. And the worst thing you could do is be all in on video because it's so resource intensive compared to lots of other things. Sorry, I've gone really into my thoughts on videos here, and I've got many. But yeah, it works as part of a mix. Yeah. I think too often a video or a lot of resources is poured into a video without thinking about other ways that message can be used.
Yes. And you're right, in terms of the people we speak to on this podcast, the amount of investment that's going into video is huge.
Yes.
Across the board.
Yep.
And whether or not, I think you might be right, that it's over-indexed at the moment.
Yep.
And there's perhaps a little lack of that strategic element to sort of pull yourself back, get a little bit more into that behavioural audience. What do they need? What do they want? What do we want them to do?
Yep.
And then make some shot selections as opposed to the answer is always video.
Yes, yeah. And I've been in social media long enough to have lived through one pivot to video and then pivot out of video and then see the next one coming. I do think this one is more legit than the last one, I will say. I think the last one always felt a little bit like, just because the channels are telling you that they want video and that the stats are saying that it's landing in front of more people, if your message is not suited to it, it doesn't really make sense. I think that the informal video that we're leaning towards more now is much less resource intensive.
Yeah.
I've seen great results from people pivoting to video a bit more on Instagram, and obviously TikTok, it's like an inescapable form of content, and it just has to be done in a very specific way. And I'm not sure that a lot of government are ready to do that specific way.
Yes.
Well, and also kind of reformatting the entire approach we normally have to videos, because we're kind of used to this kind of like person stands in front of camera, introduces themselves. We've got some B-roll going over it. We've got a nice zoom out of their face as they're smiling. It's all some slow motion hands typing, some ukulele music. And that's almost the complete opposite formula to what works, where you're stating up front, or you're almost giving the conclusion to the video up front and then letting the rest of the video explain that.
Yeah. It is interesting though, isn't it? The impact of this, the democratization of the factors of media production and distribution, because in the old days you needed heavy and expensive equipment, whereas now that's gone.
Oh, and I talk all the time about we've got an army of iPhone wielding content creators out there now, and that is the max level of quality that you actually need for most of social media.
It's remarkable the quality that the iPhones are generating these days.
Yep.
The 4K quality that you're seeing on some of the phones.
And I also think that as soon as something is and I am obviously talking about certain channels here, not all. I think that the expectation of what goes on LinkedIn is quite a different thing, and people there to see different content. But if we're talking about some of the more informal, traditional social media channels, something being well lit and color graded, whether or not people know what that is or what goes into that, it's immediately reading as something corporate that they've seen a lot of times before, and that their feed is clogged up with.
Yeah.
Not something that they are immediately interested in.
Sure. So your journey then out of South Australia, you went across to Victoria, and was it the police where you went to first, or was it with the Ombudsman?
It was the Ombudsman. So I went back to SA Health, went back into a Stratcoms role.
Yep.
Then I went to the Ombudsman, which was a media Stratcoms generalist social type of role.
Yep.
Then went to the Department for Environment, Land, Water and Planning, which is where I did fires, and also had the opportunity to work at the State Command Centre during the 2019-2020 bushfires.
Oh, wow.
So I think I literally worked New Year's Day, which is the day that people were trapped on the beach in Malakuta.
Yes.
And then I was still intermittently doing work in the State Command Centre.
What did you learn? What did you learn in those crises about?
So much.
Yeah.
So much, because I could probably pinpoint that exact time as the time when my view of social media became less formal. And I began to form these thoughts around informality being a better way of approaching social media. So one of the things that they had set up, which was really cool, was basically there's a handful of government departments in Victoria who have a memorandum of understanding with the Emergency Management Victoria. And so when there's an emergency, the idea is they essentially are the control agency for it. State Command Centres get stood up and people get pulled in there. So you're given half a day of training about a couple of different roles in there, and you step in and you give it a go. And the attitude is very much we're there to give information to people as quickly as possible, as long as we're giving information that's consistent with the lines we have and consistent with the information that we have directly from emergency services. All that matters is that they get that information immediately, which was so different to what I was used to. And it was also really cool to see people so empowered to just get stuff done. And so basically a map would come in, or the information would come in and be this is an exclusion zone now, or it's an evacuation zone. That would be put straight on a tile and it would be sent out to everyone that followed that channel. And if people asked comments or they sent direct messages to the channels that were taken over, the staff who were working as social media officers that day were empowered to respond to it directly and be hey, here's the deal, here's the information you're after, without having to go any further to get that approved. And I thought it was such an important way of working in an emergency, and that people were really responsive to receiving information like that. And so I was still intermittently getting shifts in there because the fires were still ongoing when coronavirus started to become a thing. And I remember having a conversation. I think there'd started to be current affairs stories on it and things like that. And I remember asking one of the senior people in there, do you think coronavirus is going to become an emergency? Will that be something that's managed out of here? And they weren't like 100% sure, but they were like, oh, it does seem like it's maybe heading in that direction. And I actually happened to be in South Australia the week and it became clear that we were all going into lockdown. And I popped in to see my friends at SA Health, like being like, hello, she's back. Come speak to me. And they were like frantically having to like prep a like landing site for COVID-19 the very next week. I think particularly
So
that
did you
next...
stay?
No, I mean,
Were you able to get back into Victoria?
I got back into Victoria, and yeah, the next week I think I spent like 2 days at work. We were actually super lucky at Delt that we were really ready to like go work from home because there'd been like an issue with the building at some stage and they'd had to already do it. But other places I think were like a lot less prepared to do everyone working from home. But I think by that Easter I was working Emergency Management Victoria in the State Command Centre for coronavirus, answering questions from people who were locked down. Yeah, we did just go
and
from...
were had you retained that authenticity from the bushfires? Had you retained the permission environment where you were able to move quickly, or was it a different operating environment where all of a sudden it's like, oh no, we've got to go back to, we've got risk, we've got approvals processes, we've got much more formality rather than informality?
In the initial part, EMV was essentially taking over the community moderation of the Department for Health's channels, which at that stage were like relatively small channels and suddenly had a spotlight on them.
Suddenly became very big channels.
Yeah, and so we were just kind of responding to questions as we usually would in line with the messaging we'd been given. But it was quite different because we had less kind of information sources. And I think also like no one knew the answers to anything. Yeah, it was different. But like I had kind of this background of like when it works really well, when it's a really like well-oiled machine, what it looks like.
Do you have any theories as to, because again, you go through COVID, you go through those bushfires, you see the power of authenticity, you see the power of responsiveness, you see the power of that informality that you've mentioned, but then we sort of, the body returns to its sort of, its traditional conservative state of, oh, hang on, we're now going to have to get 3 levels worth of approvals before something sort of lands. Do you have any theories about how that may be overcome, and is it changing in your experience? Are you seeing improvements in people's attitudes, or senior leaders more relevantly, that their attitudes to permission and movement?
I think it's really fascinating because it seems like everyone is relatively happy to default to being really agile in an emergency.
Yes.
And then as soon as you move back out of that space, like the old habits come back. Like reflecting on my time at police, I was like super lucky because they are always like set up for an emergency, that we were able to kind of like imbue our like general approach to things with that, like, you just need to get the information.
But police also, more generally, they got social media a lot earlier than everybody else. They got humour.
Exactly.
They got informality. They got...
Yeah.
And that's how they, certainly have, across, whether it's New Zealand, Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales, ACT, everyone does it. The police are really, they do it well, don't they?
Yeah, and the approach to it is certainly a lot more mature. And in general, I would just say that like particular area is a little bit more, I don't want to say fast and loose because that's not like the correct way of framing it. It's more that like those organisations are set up to fix a problem, whereas like quite often other organisations are like set up to find problems, or other government organisations. And so I think in policing, someone sees a problem, everyone below them's job it is to fix it. You find often in other government agencies that like someone who is like extremely senior can see a problem, and like by the time you socialise that concept to within an inch of its life, and it goes through every stakeholder and their dog, you come out the other end with something that is like no one cares about it anymore.
Yeah, no one cares. Too late, finished.
Yeah, so that's why I always describe police and their approach to social as kind of like a really good case study for if you like loosen up a little bit, like what you could achieve. And do I have a good idea of how to I think that we had some luck with it at DELP by kind of segmenting, these are the things that need lots of buy-in from elsewhere. These are the things that we are doing for reasons that are a bit more like they're only relevant to us or they're only relevant to our strategy. And these are the things that like need to get out. And so they need to, time is all that matters for them. And kind of like taking a tiered approach to like how those are like actually what approvals they need to move through. And I always say to people as well, and this is just like an approach that I've always used, and that is if you've got an idea that you like really love or like a boundary that you really want to push, have your like piece of content that you're like, this is my ideal scenario. Have a piece of content that is like the most basic, boring thing you've ever seen in your life that there's no reason that it shouldn't be approved. And then have somewhere in the middle that you're like actually just kind of happy to settle with. And if you present someone with those three options, one you say, this is the best thing ever, one you say, this is the worst thing ever, they will normally pick the middle option. And so as long as you're happy to go with that, then like you could probably even have an option that you know is never going to go up there for your top one and manipulate the middle one to be approved.
But I think also the key in what you're suggesting there goes back to that necessary strategic planning and strategic objectives. And because leadership is interested in achieving business objectives, they're interested in risk.
Yeah.
And if you can present your solutions in the language that they speak, you're much more likely to make progress if you can say, hey, you know, I understand the risk. I understand what we're trying to achieve. And here is what we see as the solution. You're much more likely to succeed than, hey, here's just a bit of content. What do you think?
Yeah, especially if that content seems a little bit wild to them, if they've got no way to contextualize what it's actually trying to achieve or why this works. And that is the biggest battle that you have when you work in social media. Trying to explain these concepts or like vernacular that like don't look like what is seen every day. And it's the path of least resistance for social media content will always be presenting something that essentially looks like what all of the other materials look like. And that is also like the worst strategy for social media. So you have to be able to explain why a departure from that look and feel makes sense for this piece of content.
How do you plan your communications up the line and the communication of your successes and the communication of your progress? Are you, when you're working with your teams, are you always saying to them, we've got to communicate in the organisation to show them what we're doing, because if we don't, no one's going to notice, and we'll be on the chopping block soon enough if they need to find budget savings or something.
And I've actually I think there's a lot of layers to my response to this one. At its like lowest level, if someone helps you out with a piece of content and they like agree to be talent or they film it or anything, going back to them with like a relatively formal like, this is how it went. These are some of the comments we got. Closing the loop with them on that basis.
And so that's just someone who you've reached out to say, hey, I need you to help me with this. And they did it. And you've gone back and...
and you've given them something tangible.
You closed the story with them.
You've given them something that they can be like, oh, I assisted with this or I contributed in this way. And so then that also puts you in a position where you've spent a little bit of time to do that, pull that together for them, and then that can then contribute to your monthly reporting as an example. So I'm sure my team hated it, but at VicPol we spent a lot of time on our monthly reporting, and that reporting wasn't just like some numbers on a document. It was something that explained what did well, because I can tell you from working at some relatively big government agencies, the easiest way that you can achieve big numbers is to infuriate people. Nothing does numbers more than someone hating you. And so it would be disingenuous for me to say, we reached 3 million people last week when 2.8 of those million people were there like yelling at us, being like, you're the worst people in the entire world. So it's really important to actually provide some like insight into the whys. So the structure I always talk about is like having a page which is like a summary, which has got your like, hey, we did this really cool thing. And, these are the really like watertight strategic things we did as well. They didn't do as well. So you're not going to see like me pour my heart out about how spectacularly they did. They were functional. They existed. And we did them because you really need us to do them. And here's some of the things that like were kind of hard the last month. Put that on the front page so that if all they read is the front page, that doesn't matter.
Okay.
and then carve out some time for case studies that like actually go like, this thing worked really well or this thing didn't work really well, and here's why we think that's the case. And quite often, if you've used someone for talent and that post does really well or whatever, you're able to take exactly what you gave them to say thank you for assisting us and just drop that straight in there. And so then that leaves you in a position where like when you get to the other end of the year or 6 months, because I like to give a 6 month kind of like report, you can then package something up that you've got all the like these best moments like already pulled out, and you're just like dropping them back into a new document for all the people that didn't bother to read along the way.
Yeah.
Like, so you get to January and you've done all of that and you've got this kind of like really holistic like perspective of what happened across the year that everyone has contributed to, because I think it's super important that not just one person knows how to do reporting. Like I always wanted my team to understand that, like be crystal clear on what those numbers meant and like understand that just because this kind of looked good, it actually, if you looked too deeply into it, like actually was bad, and how we could make people understand that.
Yep.
You get to January and you're looking at like, okay, what are our priorities for the next year? And you're able to be like, here's a summary from last year. Use that to justify the things that you want to do for the next year. And after all of that, you've got this like document where you've explained exactly what is in your brain, and turn that into a 1 page that can go to people who aren't going to realistically do that. Turn that into a presentation that you can give at your like department meeting and explain what worked last year, what we want to do next year. Here's some stuff, some trends that are relevant in the industry at the moment. And so you've kind of got this like multi-tiered approach when actually all you've done is add like one new thing onto each of them.
Yeah.
At that very bottom rung of that reporting was what was the foundation block of the rest of it.
Yeah. That's clever.
I thought so.
Well, yeah. Well, it's a lovely way of you recutting what you've already done and reshaping it for a different audience at a different time for a different purpose. You know, what we're always talking about, how do you repurpose your content? That's all you're effectively doing it.
Yeah.
But I also love the fact that you've put case studies and you've put people into their role.
Yep.
You've highlighted them, and their teams and their branches and their divisions are seeing that, hey, look, we're a part of it. So it builds morale, it builds momentum, it builds support. So at the senior leadership group meeting, when they're talking about it, they can say, oh, no, look, we featured.
I think the case studies are definitely the most important part because, and I think I mentioned this at the conference, I was like, there is no value in throwing a bunch of numbers with no context at people. And I think there's also, it's not useful for you to make your leadership feel dumb when they've got a bunch of stuff in front of them.
Yeah.
You want to make them sound smart when they're trying to explain like what you're doing.
Yeah.
So like the way to do that is to give them like a little story to latch onto.
Absolutely.
Like a big number and a little story to latch onto, which will explain it. And then the other part of all of this as well is like, if you know that you routinely get asked to report on certain things, have them in your regular reporting. And then at the end of the year, like those can just be pulled out as well one by one. So we had things like, obviously road safety content was incredibly important at VicPol. We had a like page dedicated to road safety in every month's report. Yep. And that meant that if someone turned to us tomorrow and was like, what have you guys posted or what have you done on social media in the last 3 months on road policing, we'd be able to be like, here you go, here's a 3-month report. Yeah. And it would look like we had written it exactly for them when it was actually just came from things we were already doing.
Yeah. Your experience in the police, when you sort of look back to it, what are, say, the 2 or 3 things that you took from there, apart from the importance of reporting, the importance of people? What are the other things that you've taken with you as you sort of head to this new role that you have at the Australian Renewable Energy Authority?
That's a very good question. I think my biggest takeaway from that job will always be I was so lucky to have an extraordinary team there. They were so autonomous. They were so eager to learn. And it was so exciting to watch them learn and to come in like really green and then to be like become more strategic. And I think I kind of, regardless of like, they're not necessarily things that were directly from VicPol, but I learned a lot about myself and my own leadership style in that environment. And I was super lucky to kind of like land a few of my philosophies on leadership there.
Which are?
I think my number one, like I have no interest in creating like a life or in a job. I don't think that we should be creating public servants who are, and it's really unfortunate because I think you're incentivized in the private sector to continue to expand because they can create roles for you, whereas in public sector, unfortunately, like that doesn't happen. But my thinking was always around like teaching my team as much as I could, giving them as many diverse skills as they could, because I'm very aware that I've been on the other side of feeling like social media is too much of a niche specialty to be super employable. So how can I give them other skills that they can apply to like different areas of comms? And yeah, like how can I make them a like more holistic staff member or like worker, setting them up best for their next role? And that was something that literally did come from the opportunity of like hiring people who I thought were like a good fit for the role, or hiring people that I thought were like a little bit of like an unusual fit for the role, and like watching them grow into it.
It's a lovely part of leadership, isn't it, when you see people grow?
Yeah, very nice.
And you see them come through and do great things and then move on to their next challenge
100%.
where they're better equipped and more able to do it.
Yep.
So you're now arriving, you've parked the car, you're not long there, you've only been there a very short period of time. How do you approach these new roles? How do you think about these new roles? How have you got yourself ready to start to come in and to now as the director of channels and content for Arena? How have you been thinking about getting ready for that job?
I mean, I might even go a step back as to like why I was interested, because as I said, I did adore my team at VicPol. We got to do lots of fun work. My thinking about going back into something that was a bit more
Sorry to interrupt
generous.
you there. Though, did you burn yourself out at VicPol? No?
No.
You're okay?
I guess I've probably somewhat touched on it, but my team was so autonomous that I was just like, I feel like I'm the least relevant person here. Like they are all... It did give me the freedom to think about things a bit more long term and plan things like we really need to get on TikTok, or I'd love to like look at how we can use these different tools. And
policing is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It is, but
things can happen anytime.
It's crazy how much you become immune to. Like I feel like VicPol's quietest day is like every other department's busiest day in some ways, as far as like they're on the front page. Yeah. I don't think they would ever go a full week without being on the front page. No. Whereas like it would be quite a big deal at most government agencies if they were like that week's front page story. Yeah. So you do become like somewhat immune to it because there's always so much happening, and you kind of like, it's all in a day's work. I don't know. Yeah.
Another day, another crisis.
Yeah,
it's okay.
exactly.
Oh, well, we had that one compared to last week. This is a nothing burger.
We've done that crisis before.
Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you. Getting ready for this new job.
I think I was super ready to go back to like learning something and being really surprised. I mean, it actually fitted in really well with what we're discussing, in that like things cease to surprise you or have that same like shock value. And I think I get the best out of myself when I'm learning. And I came into the role at VicPol was like with a really solid like background in social and strategy and stuff like that. And so the learning component there for me was getting to like grow my own team, growing to myself as a leader. Yeah. And so once I kind of was at the point where I was like, this team don't need me. I was like, I need to go and do something where I'm learning again. And for me, that was like going back into something that is like a relatively foreign
subject matter.
Something I am very interested in and like really passionate about the kind of like background behind, but not something that I'm an expert on by any stretch of the imagination. And something that's probably like a little bit further beyond my like, I think the everyday influences of Victoria Police, like, everyone knows and understands. I think most people without even realising know a lot of
machine.
Yeah. Whereas like renewable energy and like the economics of it all is something that like you don't know unless you know or you've got like some kind of background in it. And it's been really exciting to like really have to use my brain and learn things.
And think about how do you take complex subject matter and how do we move it to a point of either it stays complex because that's relevant for that particular audience or to broaden it, we're going to have to do something a little bit different here.
Yeah, and being especially in that kind of like emergency space, I've spent a long time thinking about messaging for the public.
Yes.
And actually one of my favourite things about my first role at SA Health was that as the comms advisor, you would not take care of one piece or another. You would do the external comms, you would do the social media, you would do the internal comms, you would do all of it. So this is an interesting space in that like our main, like it's really important that the community understands that we're working for them, but they're also not, like it's a granting organisation. So it's not just the general community that need to know about like their core business. Their core business needs to be understood and known by the people who are likely, who they want to invest in.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very interesting, and it's a very different like mindset to what I've had to be in recently.
So just to close it up, I'm interested in your views of generally, if you're looking across government communications, for someone who's spent, or dedicated a significant part of their career or most of their career to public service and to have seen it on that journey from where it is. Where do you see it today, if you were to sort of sit back for a moment and be a commentator as to where you see it, and how can it continue to improve?
That is a very fascinating question. I mean, I think I can see, I don't want to speak too much about specifics, but I do think like we are only partway on our journey towards decoupling like media and comms from traditional media, because, you know, in general, the most senior leaders in an organisation still very much like part of the cohort that like do really consume traditional media. I think that people have almost like overcorrected in when it comes to social media into believing it can fix like all of the other problems, which is not the truth. I think it'll be really fascinating to see how people start to leverage new media like podcasts and things like that with like very specific audiences, and I'm like fascinated to see how they do that. I'm really excited to see whether the public service is like capable of using influencers or like finding the right influencers. I think there's been quite like niche cases, but it, you know,
well, they tried it a few years ago in the APS and then banned it after it went,
and I can
wrong.
see why it's a very fraught area, but like I do think it's also when people have a really relevant following, it could be a really powerful thing to use, as long as it's not forced. I do feel like a lot of the time you're like, we should use influencers, and it's just like, I'm sorry, I really don't think there's anyone that like wants to align with us right now. It's like not our like shining moment. So, but I think part of that as well is like also people trusting the public service to look after their best interests, because then it's less of a risk for them to actually take some ownership of those relationships.
But it's also a bit of the definition, isn't it, about influencer as, you know, a sort of, you know, a girl tottering around with a, you know.
I think that's part of the problem too.
As opposed to someone who has a serious following and who is connected and has trust with a particular audience who you want to be connected to.
And to be honest, you could probably put, so like influencers and their own social media followings in with the bucket of podcasting, to be honest, because there is that is like often a group of things that fit together and that have like a very niche audience, and they have multiple ways of distributing their content as well. So leveraging that as like as a way of kind of getting a message out, I think will be really important as well. I think it's really fascinating to consider whether there's going to be at some stage chucking it on Facebook became the new kind of like brochure. You know how we used to have like trifold brochures for everything and be like, oh, you've got diabetes, here's a brochure. I think at some stage there's probably we became like, oh, you've got diabetes, put it on Facebook. So it'll be interesting to see whether like some of those other things those other tools that are a bit harder to measure come back. I don't know. I was actually thinking the other day when I went to go vote, I saw on the wall of the voting booth a poster from COVID era Department for Health, and I was like, our work really does outlive us. I don't know why they've still got a check-in code there. I don't think there's any value in scanning that one now, but it's still going. And posters, can't measure their effect, but they do last decades on some walls. I've seen some vintage ones.
Yeah. But it does sort of rolls back, doesn't it, to, you know, the value and use of what we do has to be connected to a purpose. It has to be connected to an objective, and it's the sort of essence of that. That's the foundation piece, you know. If, you know, the tools and the techniques and all the other bits and pieces. Yes, you've got to roll those together, but unless you start with a clear purpose. you're going to end up in you could end up anywhere.
Yeah, and I think basically every conversation is devolving into being about AI now, which I'm sure
we almost got through this whole podcast without it.
But I mean, I definitely think like something that plays on my mind as someone who's like in that digital space is considering how relevant measures of like click-through are going to be when something is just like scraping the relevant stuff off and people are never actually having to click through. So like, there's a lot of like measurement stuff that we pivoted to like everything has to be measurable. And now we're kind of in a position where I'm like, we're having to consider whether we're going back to some of the old immeasurable tactics.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting. Like, it's fascinating. I've obviously been around for quite some time and seen the changes as they roll through, but it's exciting. It's important. I think that's the other thing around, and it's essentially why we do this podcast, is because of the importance of public sector and government communication. That importance of explaining, policy, program, services, regulation. If we live in a world where there is a trust deficit, the best way to fix that is to explain stuff to people. Because they might not agree with you, but if you take the time to let them know what the policy is and what the problem is that they're trying to solve and the reasons why you've made that decision, I think we can make some progress towards, restoring and building on that trust.
And I think we also, and I mean, we haven't discussed TikTok, but like a problem I see across the board is like we're so reliant on these tools that don't reach young people. And I say young, but like we're talking about people under 30.
Yeah.
And under 60, we're all young. Yeah, I definitely feel like we've probably like lent into this idea that we are like reaching young people on social media for like way too long, and that's like not happening.
Yeah.
And when I was given the like space to think about strategy and what we needed to do in the future at VicPol, like the thing that really grabbed me was we need to position ourselves to speak to young people because they are so relevant to like so many of our key issues and our organisational priorities.
Yeah. So we do have time.
Okay.
It's a podcast, so keep going. I know you have a plane to catch, so we'll make sure that you make the plane. But take me through that consideration set. Obviously, strategically thinking about your audience and understanding that, okay, across all of these different areas, my key audience are people who are aged under 30, under 25, whatever they were. And, the answer equals we've got to be on TikTok. So how did that conversation start? How did you overcome all of the bogeyman fears about, data and, the Chinese Communist Party having a backdoor into your organisation?
Yeah.
How did you go through and how did you carried the day? So that it's a good story.
I think part of it goes back to what I mentioned before, which is that it's super important to be able to translate something that to be a good idea into like that kind of corporate vernacular that's going to get across the line. And so, like it's very clear to me, and I think anyone that works, even if you were someone who was an avid Facebook user and no longer are, like that is the sort of thing that plays on my mind, because I'm like, if I'm not using it and other younger people than me aren't using it, and we've kind of gone all in on that, like VicPol has like 800,000 followers on their corporate channel on Facebook.
Yeah, but how many of them are there now?
I don't know.
Yeah.
And it is really hard to
active.
quantify it because they don't want people to know those answers to those questions either, and that as well like has my like scalp prickling, like the idea that they're not actually very transparent about any of those things anymore. So it became really clear to me that was a direction we needed to go in. And at that stage, Instagram was pretty like stagnant as well. Yep. I think Instagram has kind of stepped up to the plate as far as giving visibility to, pages that don't already have a heap of visibility subsequently because of the challenge that TikTok has mounted. But essentially we had to go back to like, okay, what are our organisational priorities? And there's a few things that feature in there that like the key audience for is under 24s. And we can show you that we are not followed by people who are under 24.
Yeah.
And so if you're really serious about tackling this problem, particularly like road trauma, then we do actually need to be on this channel and be speaking to people on that channel in the way that they are used to be spoken to, so not in the usual ways. And we were super lucky that particularly in the road trauma space, they are keen to just throw spaghetti at the wall and do like absolutely anything they can to address that problem. And then the other thing is police recruitment, of which people under 24 are a key demographic. So we were able to essentially write a strategy, a channel strategy, which outlined what the key content we would be posting on that channel was.
Yep.
Speak to why we wanted to be there, what sort of tone we wanted to have there, how responsive we wanted to be there, and then package it up in like a brief that was essentially like, this is why this is so important and this is why it can't be put off. Because...
And what about the risks? How did you address the risks?
So, and I don't know if this is the case for elsewhere. Like I noticed that the Australian Electoral Commission has a TikTok now, which I thought was really interesting, and I'd love to know more.
They got permission.
Yeah. So basically, the whole of Vic government changes, guidance, was that it couldn't be on a phone that was on network.
Yep.
And it had to be stored in a specific
fair
way.
Enough. Righto. Yeah.
And we already had off-network phones that we used for content creation.
Yep.
So it was actually relatively easy for us to do once that guidance landed. Mm-hmm. We were caught in the void waiting for that guidance to land for probably 9 months, which put it off. So like everything was ready, approved. We were like basically ready to hit go. And then APS made the decision that it couldn't be used on government phones, which then trickled down to VPS, and then we kind of had to wait for that guidance to land. Once it landed, I was like, oh, that's easy to...
Good.
We can do that so well.
How did it perform?
Great. It's wild. It's very different algorithmically to other channels. If you post like good TikTokable content on there, it can reach millions of people so much more easily than what you post on Facebook. It's like the things that get posted on Facebook that reach millions of people, like few and far between. TikTok has the ability to do that incredibly easily. On the flip side, if it's not the right sort of content for the channel, it will go almost nowhere.
To the graveyard.
But yeah, so it's almost like the ceiling is like incredibly high on there.
The incentive, I imagine too, if we get this right, the payoff's enormous.
It also, your following matters so much less there. You know, like people who use TikTok a lot will know that if you watch someone and don't go to the trouble of following them, but you continue to watch them, like they'll continue to come up for you. So it's not something that you don't need to be concerned about like stagnating growth on there, because ultimately if you try things and do them in the right way, it's still going to hit at some stage. It's much less of a slow burn than other channels, I would say.
Are you going to take TikTok to Arena?
I don't think it's necessary everywhere, to be super clear. And I do strongly believe, I'm certainly not someone that just like follows the bright and shinies to try new things for the sake of it.
Yeah.
I don't believe in using government resources to do anything that I don't think there is like a really watertight reason to do. Mm-hmm. And so there's like other things, like I'd love to see someone in government use Reddit really well, things like that. Yeah, I don't think we need a TikTok arena, and I don't think there's a lot of government agencies that don't. But certainly, if you have a key reason to reach under 30s, it's probably something worth investigating.
Very good. Well, Kendall Masters, thank you so much for coming in and spending some of your time with us today. A masterclass for the audience, and thank you for sharing your experience, because it's always good to hear the stories of people who have achieved a great deal in public sector communication. And best of luck with your new job at Arena and whatever follows after that. So you stay in the public sector? Will you still keep working down that path?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there's lots to do. Like the thing is, it's infinitely, it's important.
Yeah.
And the scope and the opportunity. Like you're always going to find someone. Or somewhere that's got a really great story to tell, like the place you've arrived at now.
And there's also there's a huge difference between like small departments, big departments.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And like projects.
Yeah.
I think there's some like really exciting projects and things that happen as well.
Oh, of course.
And when they come up, like I'd love to work on an infrastructure project or something at some stage.
Or a major event.
Yeah.
You know, like a COP.
COP is exactly what I was thinking.
Okay. Very good. Exactly. Like a big global event like that would be a lot of fun. The Olympics is not far away either. You never know. You could end up there.
I don't know if Queensland's for me. I could be convinced I do like the warm. I'm not sure that I like the humidity. Anyway.
Well, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very
thanks
much.
to you, the audience, for coming back once again. What a great conversation with a charming, talented leader in the public sector here in Australia, and really you could probably listen to that twice and really go back and take a number of things, because obviously the purpose of this podcast is for us all to learn. And the reason I do it is because everyone who sits opposite me or on the podcast, I generally take lots of information from them and go and use it, but that's the way it goes. But yeah, what a great conversation, and a big thanks to Kendall for coming in to the studio. And thanks to you again, the audience, for coming back. A rating or a review, it does help us to be found. Those algorithms that we're mentioning, they do like to respond. So if you do have a chance to jump on, it doesn't take long to be able to do it, and it will help us to be found. You can find all the latest information, updates and insights from all of our other GovComms episodes on LinkedIn at the GovComms Institute. And it was a joy to speak to Kendall today, and we look forward to bringing you another great story from the world of communications in a month's time. So very grateful for your support as always. My name is David Pembroke, and it's bye for now.
You've been listening to the GovComms podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes.